Hello, this will be the video reaction for week 11 and 12's content. Sorry if I sound a little annoyed. I was like 9 minutes into a video and my phone was like, you ran out of storage. That was great, so I'm back at it. Hopefully this time there's enough storage on my phone for the full video. Let's get into this. Week 11's content, had a bunch of videos to watch. First one I want to discuss was the Say Her Name video. Obviously this reminds me a lot of the beginning of the course with intersectionality, because it talks about like how everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people know about the black men who are killed by the police and the racism of the police towards black men, but not a lot of people talk about the racism towards black women. That obviously connects to the readings we're doing for the class, with Richie's book, Policing Women, and how biased and how racist the system is, specifically towards black women, but not a lot of people talk about it. The statistic, there's a few statistics in the video. The one that stood out to me the most was 1 out of 3 of the women and girls shot by the police are black, which on the surface that sounds like a lot, but like when you think about it for like half a second, it gets way worse, because black people aren't even a third of the population. They're less than that, and there's a lot of communities where the black population might be just like minuscule. And so the fact that 1 out of the 3 women and girls shot by the police are black, it's an insane statistic given how population works. Like, there should be nowhere near that high, and yet it is, and no one talks about it, especially when compared to the racism towards black men. So sad, but on the bright side, there are things like the Say Her Name movement and intersectionality which seek to fix this. And then so hopefully the best way to fight against this is people being informed. So hopefully these movements and whatnot gain more traction and more people talk about it, and hopefully things can get better. The second video I want to talk about was the interview with some of the BLM founders. One of the women talks about how climate change obviously has changing the environment and whatnot, and especially with natural disasters and how it affects countries. But most of the countries most affected by climate change are in Africa, which is horribly messed up, because the reason the environment is so whack is because of the industrialized countries, like China, United States, Europe, India, and whatnot. And a lot of those countries, a lot of those industrial companies which have contributed to the pollution, were the countries that participated in the slave trade and extracting resources from Africa to be used in the home country. And so nowadays, not only have they been historically exploited, but the countries that have exploited them are polluting the environment, and that environment is now affecting Africa the most. So there's just, I feel like it goes back to like historically, just Africa has been exploited, and now the countries that have exploited it are messing up the environment and making things worse in Africa, which is incredibly sad. They also discuss for a little bit Haiti, and how Haiti was experiencing natural disasters and disease, and the United Nations just didn't do anything. And Haiti is a predominantly black country, and it is also an incredibly poor country, and the more advanced countries just didn't help them, which once again is horribly sad. But also, if this was another country that was predominantly white, I'm willing to bet the United States, the United Nations, European countries and whatnot would have stepped in and be like, we're going to give you aid, and we're going to help probably supply you with vaccines and whatnot to fight against these outbreaks of diseases. But no one did that, most likely because it's a poor black country. So once again, horribly sad, and just historically awful. One of the concepts that there's a concept discussed in the video which I hadn't heard before, which is the idea of like trickle down equality, and then obviously this compared to trickle down economics. which immediately hearing that, I was like, oh no, because trickle down economics historically has been awful. Uh, it does not trickle down. It's just the people at the top, or people who are already rich just get richer, and those who are poor remain poor. So, and it talks about how, if white people are here and black people are here, then we shouldn't raise white people in the hopes that black people go up. So we got to focus on the floor and bring that up. And specifically, they talk about that statistic, which is very popular, where 78 cents that a 78 cents a woman makes is to $1 that a man makes, but that's white woman to white man. Black women to white man is 68 cents for every dollar, and indigenous people actually make less than 68 cents, if I remember correctly from the video. So we shouldn't focus on trying to raise the dollar. We should focus on, the people making a lot less and trying to get closer to $1. This makes a lot of sense to me, and I feel like also connects to, intersectionality, because a lot of people know that 78 to $1 comparison. But once again, that's for white people. But if you look closer and more specific, for minorities, it's even worse. And that's kind of thing with intersectionality. It's like, yeah, it's a women's issue, but it's also specifically a women's minority issue. And, upon hearing the statistics, it also reminds me of this article I was reading that talked about how the wealth gap in America is the greatest it's been since like the Gilded Age, which is insane because back then, you had monopolies and whatnot, these huge companies that were just invincible, that completely dominated the market. And like somehow nowadays, there's like, it's like equivalent in the wealth gap between, the poor and between the rich and the poor. And so we shouldn't focus on, giving the rich benefits in hopes that increases the poor. We should probably, give poor people the benefits in hopes to bring the floor up. That doesn't happen though, and that's really sad. And yeah, it just reminded me of what was being discussed in that video. So then now let's talk about the week 12 readings. Talks about quality of life offenses, quality of life policing, and how that ties into broken windows. I wrote about this in class with the it was like there's a question like that for one of the movies. And how they're all connected, and how these policies gave way to really bad policies like the stop and frisk in New York, where there's a statistic like 40% of all stop and frisks in New York was for black and Mexican people, and yet only 4 point something percent of New York is black and Mexican, but they were 40% of the stop and frisks, which just shows how, the police targeted people based off their race, and how, like, when the police focus on minorities, they end up over-policing minority neighborhoods, and obviously this affects the trust in those neighborhoods, and so those neighborhoods turn away from the police and view the police not as, friendly or, efficient. They instead come to despise the police, and then this gives way to, like gangs and whatnot, because the police can't be trusted, so the community tries to find other ways to remain to keep things going. And this contributes to how black people have a lower life expectancy compared to white people. There's a difference of, I didn't write it down, but it's a difference. It's a significant difference between the two, and a good chunk of that is due to police, and how black people, their interactions with police are very different than how white people are interacting with police, which leads me to the second reading, which talks about San Diego police interactions with minorities and whatnot. And they interviewed a bunch of police about racism, and a bunch of the police gave excuses that were pretty much word for word what Benito Silva talks about in his book, where they were like, oh, there's no racism because we got black police officers. Oh, there's no racism because my lieutenant's black or whatnot, which isn't really an excuse. And a lot of them were like, oh, racism doesn't exist. If it does exist, it's only between a few bad apples and not like the system at large, which is wrong. And what was really not funny, but just really ironic, is all these officers are being like, oh yeah, racism doesn't exist. But when, like, asked questions about how they police, the police were just quite racist. Like some of them said like, oh, racism doesn't exist, but when I pull over someone, if it's a white person with tattoos, I'm not that worried, but if it's a black person with tattoos, I assume that they're part of a gang or whatnot. Which is like, you can't say you're not racist but then say something like that. You can't be like, oh, racism doesn't exist, but then immediately talk about how you racially profile and whatnot. And so it's sad to hear things like that, because obviously things only get better when people are educated, and these people don't see that there's an issue and they're not educated, and so they're just going to keep things going. They're not going to try to break the system or make things better because they're not educated. And so it makes me wonder if there's a way to better educate the police on this issue, so they could see that, like, damn, there actually is a lot of issues within the system, and instead of them ignoring it or being ignorant or feigning ignorance and whatnot. And so yeah, hopefully, I mean, I figured a lot of that could be fixed with training. The whole police academy thing. Maybe if there was a section that specifically talked about these issues, then a lot of police going into the police force would have a better idea and have a better grasp on things and the racism within the system, and then they could do work to try to fix things. But that's just an idea. I don't know. I hope things get better. That's the end of the video. Bye bye.